Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. China warns of humanitarian consequences after U.S. decides to send cluster bombs to Ukraine. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky at the summit in Vilnius says that the summit must confirm Ukraine as de facto NATO member. Plus, Sergei Lavrov says UN efforts on grain deal have not yielded results as return of Azov commanders breaks the agreement. Thank you for joining us. A spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Mao Ning, warns that the United States' decision to transfer cluster bombs to Ukraine could lead to humanitarian consequences. The U.S. Department of Defense announced last week an additional security assistance package of up to $800 million to Ukraine, which includes cluster bombs. Speaking at a regular press briefing in Beijing, she says, the irresponsible provision of cluster munition is highly likely to cause humanitarian issues. Humanitarian concerns and legitimate military and security needs should be addressed in a balanced manner, and the transfer of cluster munition should be treated with prudence and restraint. She adds that China always believes that dialogue and negotiation is the only viable way out of the Ukraine crisis, and parties concerned should not add fuel to the fire and escalate the tension, which will make the Ukraine crisis even worse. Meanwhile, several countries have announced they will not send Ukraine cluster munition following the United States' decision to do so to the front line. U.S. President Joe Biden defended his decision as difficult but necessary, saying Ukraine needed them and has assured Washington that the bombs will not be used to target territory inside Russia. More than 100 countries, including the UK, Germany, and Canada, have signed an accord under the Convention on Cluster Munition to ban the production, stockpiling, use, and transfer of cluster bombs. Paul Hannon of the Cluster Munitions Coalition says the U.S. move will contribute to the terrible casualties being suffered by Ukrainian civilians both immediately and for years to come. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the majority of NATO members stood together with his country, and the Vilnius summit must confirm that Ukraine is a de facto member of the military alliance. Speaking in his usual nightly address, Mr. Zelensky said, in his words, "When we applied for membership of NATO, we spoke frankly, de facto. Ukraine is already in the alliance. Our weapons are the weapons of the alliance. Our values are what the alliance believes in." President Zelensky also says further weapon supplies for Ukraine in its war against Russia will also be discussed at the summit.
When we applied for membership of NATO, we spoke frankly. De facto, Ukraine is already in the alliance. Our weapons are the weapons of the alliance. Our values are what the alliance believes in. And our defense is precisely the element of the European formula that makes it united, free, and at peace.
President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says efforts by the United Nations to ensure the implementation of the Russian part of the Black Sea grain export deal had not yet yielded results. Mr. Lavrov told a press conference after meeting foreign ministers from the Gulf Cooperation Council, those great pains have not produced any result whatsoever. Moscow has repeatedly said it sees no grounds to extend the grain deal, which enables Ukraine to export cereal from its Black Sea ports beyond July the 17th. It argues that commitments made to remove obstacles to Russian food and fertilizer exports have not been fulfilled. Meanwhile, Russia's RIA news agency says expected negotiations between Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan remains the only hope to extend the Black Sea grain deal that is set to expire next week. Now, the deal, brokered between Russia and Ukraine by the United Nations and Turkey in July 2022, aims to prevent a global food crisis by allowing Ukrainian grain trapped by Russia's invasion to be safely exported from Black Sea ports. Mr. Erdogan says he was pressing Russia to extend the grain deal, currently due to expire on July the 17th, by at least 3 months, and announced a visit by Putin in August. In the meantime, the Kremlin said that the transfer of Azov commanders from Turkey to Ukraine violates an agreement between Moscow, Ankara, and Kiev. Ties between Moscow and Ankara became strained last week after Turkey handed 5 Ukrainian commanders back to Kiev in what Russia said was a violation of a prisoner exchange agreement. The commanders of the Azov regiment, labeled a terrorist organization in Russia, released from captivity during a prisoner swap, were supposed to stay in Turkey until the end of the hostilities in Ukraine. They were part of a Ukrainian garrison that defended the Azovstal industrial complex in Mariupol against Russian forces and surrendered in May 2022. Now, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, says Moscow will be seeking explanations for the reasons behind their release and will take the fact into consideration when striking further deals with Ankara. Also asked about the prospects of the Black Sea grain deal, Mr. Peskov told reporters that there were currently no plans for President Vladimir Putin to meet his Turkish counterpart, Erdogan, to discuss renewing the deal, and that it was not known when President Putin might visit Turkey, although Mr. Erdogan says it will happen next month. Now, we'd like to speak with Major General Henry Ayola, former Commander, Operation Safe Haven, Chief of Defense Research and Development, who joins us from our Abuja studios in the Federal Capital Territory, north-central Nigeria. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you. Good morning, Macaulay.
It seems to have been a blow below the belt for Russia from Turkey, because they didn't seem to have seen it coming, this release of the Azov commanders, and it is reported to have strained their relations, but that may just be international media saying such things. Do you think that this release of the Azov commanders will have a lot of bearing on their relationships with Turkey, even as the NATO summit goes on?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very important question. Well, I think what has happened is a classical example of the popular dictum that there are no permanent friends, but permanent interest. Of course, the point where we are, Turkey needed to play the game the way he's playing it, because he has some other interest. He's also trying to advance. So you find the release of those 5. He also needed to play ball with Sweden, for example, to support them for their own pursuit of the membership of EU, and so support Sweden for the membership of NATO. He also needed to play in that line to guarantee the sale of F-16s that are coming from the US, that are still being considered in the Congress. So there are many interests. So he's using all of these as a bargaining chip for advancing her own interests. And that is expected. I'm sure Russia will also understand that at the end of the day, it's national interest that matters, and not some permanent friendship somewhere. I'm sure they will find a way to iron it out. Of course, nations understand this. Reciprocity is one of the principles in international relations, international law, and all of that. So, yeah, it will have a little, setback, but it will be. They will walk through it. It will be ironed out, and they will find ways to do some damage control. Yeah.
Major General, I'm glad you're here with your military background to give us your opinion on the deployment of these cluster munitions. They seem to be very scary. They seem to be very dastardly and very notorious. We had an expert as well, a captain with the U.S. Army here yesterday, who spoke to us on his opinions. Now that they've decided to renege on their earlier decision, the United States, that is, and are deploying these explosive ordnances, these munitions to Ukraine, do you think it's worth it in view of the fact that the Ukrainian civilians may suffer the effects for so many years to come?
Yes, thank you very much. That's a technical question, and I love it so much because it's an area of interest for me. Yes, there is a known and a standing convention on cluster munition, but good enough, America, Russia, and Ukraine are not parties to that treaty. So, of course, they have a freedom as to what to do in respect of that treaty. But yeah, talking about cluster munitions, there are a special kind of weapons that are usually dispensed either from the platform on sea, land, or air. And they are scattered, they are aerial weapons, So when they are scattered, because of the nature of their detonation, the common, the universal one, they detonate by impact. That's not to say that they cannot create the ones that can have fuse or delayed fuse detonation so that it can reduce the DOD rate. What do you call the DOD rate? DUD rate. That's the rate of failure. Because when they are scattered, some will, on impact, will explode. Some may not, depending on where they land. If they land on a soft ground or on a wet ground, they may not explode. So, and in fact, that was part of the reason why, together with landmines, they were grouped into cluster munitions that were, and a lot of the members of NATO are parties to that treaty. And it was based on the fact that they become dangerous in the environment where they are used. Years later, children could pick them up, and get maimed or get killed and all of that. But in this particular situation, America is aware, of course, of these dangers, and they've taken some steps. America has given its own reason, actually, why it has to go this way. It's like a choice between allowing Ukraine to run out of weapons, out of shells, artillery shells in particular, and become more vulnerable to Russia, or help them to, to close this lacuna, pending when they'll be able to get a more sustainable supply of artillery shells and all the other shells that they need. So it's a very delicate balance they are hard to strike. So it's like, okay, what guarantees can we get from Ukraine that they're going to deploy this in areas where the danger will be reduced? By the way, America also has a law that does not permit her to either sell or deploy such weapons where the DOD rate is higher than 1%. Okay, where the failure rate is higher than 1%. The type they are considering, supplying, the DOD rate is actually, close to 3% than 1%. So again, those in the Congress will have to do some either waiving, or the presidential fiat will be used to waive that gap, that difference, and still go ahead to do it. But it's a choice and a decision that is delicate and has to be made. And so part of the guarantees they've gotten from Ukraine is that, yeah, you're going to deploy it in an area that will not endanger civilian and not cause civilian casualties, as much as is known associated with this kind of weapon. But that's one. And secondly, that the use of it also will be followed up by a cleanup of the general area where it will be used. It's a weapon that is very good in trench warfare. And one of the areas going to be very useful for them is that a lot part of their land that Russia has taken and their troops are dug in, it will do a good work for them in trench warfare than in sniffing them out and bringing heavy casualty in those areas. So, well, the game of war is you have to weigh, rate of casualty with the necessity to use the kind of force you want to use, and either there are other options at that given time. So that's how it is. It's quite a delicate balance.
So therefore, Major General, it seems that that decision is predicated on their desire to give more verve to the counteroffensive of the Ukrainians. Are there no alternatives to the cluster munition? Why is there so much attention based on the cluster munition at this time? Is it the easy?
Functions of time, because war is very fluid, and what may be your advantage at the beginning of the war, you may lose that advantage somewhere along the line of the course of the war. Combat supply is usually a major factor. That's ammunition, water, food, ration. They are the things that keep an army or an armed forces moving. So you usually, they take the highest kind of consideration when you are making your choices. And of course, if you are already disadvantaged in one area and you have something that is already available and is coming to you free of charge, and of course, part of the advantage of it really is that once it's dispensed, in dispensing it, unlike most of the other weapons, the probability of casualty to the user is less. But once it's dispensed, the munitions, the sub-munitions or bomblets that we call them, don't know the owner either. So from the moment you dispense them, the dispenser himself, the user himself, is as vulnerable to them as the enemy you are trying to, use them on. So it's a double-edged thing. But like I said, he who wears the shoes knows where it pinches. So it's a function of what are the other options they know they have, and why they think this is a better option for them.
Okay. Let's turn our attention to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant now, where President Zelensky said yesterday that he believes, or he suspects, that the Russians may want to cause an incident at the nuclear power plant to distract from their failure, in his words, at the counteroffensive of the Ukrainians, and for their failure to continue to push their military occupation of Ukraine. In the same vein, Russia is asking that this incident be brought up at NATO and be investigated, that Ukraine has similar motives. Do you think that this situation at the nuclear power plant is something that the Russians will dare to escalate to that extent?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a strategic question because the nuclear power plant remains a very strategic target. It's not a target that will be taken on casually. Russia has said we have to weigh the implications. And with the way things have progressed and the latest development, especially with Finland had joined NATO. So you have 31 members in NATO now. And with the meeting coming up today, and with Turkey having given the go-ahead for Sweden to join, at least giving a nod, all of that are sending signals to Russia to be more cautious about his options, about how far he wants to pursue his luck in this invasion. I think, I mean, why not ruling out any possibility? Putin is not somebody you can say you can't do a particular thing. I mean, he looks like somebody who could be reckless, So you don't want to take for granted that he will not do such a thing. But ordinarily, knowing the implication of such a choice and such a target, to be on the positive side, I think it will be perpetual optimism is a force multiplier, quote our Colin Powell, late Colin Powell. I think I would want to believe that, they are not likely to do that, not now. In fact, if they had contemplated that before, maybe that would have been earlier. But the way NATO is showing promise and showing better strengths, I don't think this is a time to even try NATO or to try the collective force of that alliance. That's my judgment on that.
Finally, Major General, one of the tragedies of war is the casualties of war. And when a mother kisses her son or daughter even goodbye when they're deployed to the front line or to their duties as a soldier in whatever units that may be, it may be the last time that they'll see such a person. Now, there's unconfirmed reports by sources in the media that say as many as 50,000 Russian soldiers have lost their lives. The Russians themselves have not disclosed more than 6,000 Russian soldiers as having been deceased at this time. The Ukrainians as well are very economical with the release of the figures of the casualties on their side. With this NATO summit in view, and with the drums of war seeming to be sounded by all the EU and the NATO countries, what do you think should be done in the way of bringing both parties back to the negotiating table?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, from the history of war, we've always learned that in the final analysis, you still have to come to the peace table or to the diplomatic table to discuss peace. Well, the final end of war really is peace. So, yes, I see, I'm not sure if it's on the agenda of this meeting, but obviously it's something that will be considered. Because usually why nations go to war is also to give you an advantageous position to negotiate peace from a point of strength. Okay, so, I mean, with what has happened so far, I remember when this was started, 24th of February 2022, last year, I remember I said, look, with what Russia has started, it doesn't appear that there's a clear-cut, a clear defined strategic end state for the war. It was like just a war designed to punish Ukraine for, dancing towards NATO. And I mean, because there's no point really you can say the war has come to an end. Because really you don't know what Russia wants to achieve with all of this at the end of the day. And don't forget, they started by calling it special military operation. And it's still the special military operation that is on up till now. So for me, yes, it's a good point for NATO to come up with something that can be a win-win solution, a peace solution that we draw Russia, to have to consider it seriously. If not, it will just be an endless fighting. And I think both sides have lost so much. And the soldiers, of course, you saw what happened when the Prigozhin, marched towards Moscow. Yes. I thought it was like 200 kilometers to Moscow. And one of the points that was made by that march, by that attempt, was to actually demonstrate the fact that some of the Russians, most of the Russian people are actually tired of the war. And even a good number of the Russian soldiers saw them marching, and they didn't fire at them, they didn't attack them. I mean, that also sends a lot of signs that, look, everybody is looking for a solution. Let this thing come to an end. Because at the end of the day, nobody really gains anything from war. It's all a waste of energy, time, human lives, properties, infrastructure and all of that, like we have seen. So for me, yeah, I think it's a good time to introduce some solutions, some peaceful solution, and use all diplomatic means to attract Russia to come to the discussion table to find a final solution.
Indeed,
yes.
Indeed. We hope that it's a meeting that will not turn out to be a war room in Vilnius in Lithuania. Thank you so much, Major General Henry Ayola, former Commander Operation Safe Haven and Chief of Defense Research and Development, for being with us on the program today.
Thank you very much, my colleague. Thanks for the opportunity all the time.
After the break, mercenary chief Prigozhin met President Putin after rebellion, according to Kremlin sources. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the second half of our coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian-made reconnaissance unmanned aerial vehicle called the Leica 100 gathers intelligence data to guide artillery in targeting Russian military hardware on the Bakhmut front lines. The Leica 100 UAV, which is Ukrainian for Stork, is capable of flying behind enemy lines of defense to detect clusters of equipment, infantry, providing essential information for adjusting artillery fire. According to the unit operating the UAV, if an interesting target is spotted, the information is passed to artillery command outposts. The Ukrainian military said its troops have so far retaken 169 square kilometers on the southern front and 24 square kilometers around the eastern city of Bakhmut since its counteroffensive began last month. The Kremlin says President Vladimir Putin of Russia has held talks with the Wagner mercenary group founder Yevgeny Prigozhin and his commanders to discuss the armed mutiny Wagner attempted to mount against the army's top brass. According to the Kremlin, the meeting was held on June the 29th, 5 days after the aborted mutiny, which is widely regarded to have posed the most serious challenge to President Putin since he came to power on the last day of 1999, and that President Putin had invited 35 people to that meeting, which lasted for 3 hours, including Prigozhin and Wagner unit commanders. The brief mutiny led by Prigozhin, in which Wagner fighters took control of the southern city of Rostov-on-Don and a military headquarters building, was defused in a deal brokered by the Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko. Mr. Prigozhin says the mutiny was not aimed at overthrowing the Russian government, but at bringing to justice the army and defense chiefs for what he called their blunders and unprofessional actions in Ukraine. Elsewhere, top diplomats from Russia and the Gulf states have agreed to work on development of energy supply chains. That's according to the Russian media, citing their joint statement. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said after the meeting with the Omani Foreign Minister Saeed Badr bin Hamad and the Gulf Cooperation Council Secretary General Jassim Mohammed al-Bundawai, says in their words, today's meeting confirmed that we always lay bare our positions honestly, and not one of us is seeking to cooperate against anyone else. He added that neither Russia nor the Gulf countries had ever tried to interfere with each other's relations and third countries. An investigation by European media outlets finds that more than a year into the Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine, the EU and Ukraine have yet to implement an increase in their ammunition production. The investigation found that EU governments have signed hardly any long-term contracts with producers, while Ukraine's arms makers have also complained about a lack of state support to scale up production. Now let's talk to Dr. Olena Sniger, expert at the Center for Global Studies Strategy Ukraine, who joins us from Florence, Italy. Good morning.
Good morning.
Доброго ранку, привіт.
Доброго ранку і вам.
Right, I also wanted to see if I was on track with my attempts to learn Ukrainian. Let's start with the NATO summit at Lithuania. What are your expectations? We know that President Zelensky's are quite clear and obvious. He says he wants an invitation to NATO. He says NATO should regard, and the world should regard, Ukraine as a de facto NATO member. But there also calls for peace from all over the world in this conflict. What do you think should be the center of the discussion at this NATO summit?
Well, Ukraine indeed has big expectations from this summit and about this summit, and it's about the fast road to NATO membership, and it actually will be a kind of recognition that Ukraine is already an ally, and a very strong ally, probably one of the strongest in Europe, or even the strongest in Europe, ally in NATO, among NATO members. And the most important thing that it's it's a volunteer decision of Ukraine. It's a volunteer decision of NATO countries to be in one alliance, a defensive alliance, to protect independence and sovereignty and freedom. And it is unfortunately it is the only way to resist Russian aggression, because as we see, after 30 years after Soviet Union collapsed, and after all those attempts of diplomatic solutions with Russia and cooperation with Russia and different Russian NATO councils and agreements between Ukraine and Russia and other neighbor states of Russia. Diplomacy with Russia doesn't work unless it is supported with the power. This is the fact, this is the reality. So Ukraine really needs it. And it is also necessary for NATO, especially for those members of alliance who are in the Eastern Europe, such as Baltic states, Poland, Slovakia, Romania, etc. So we really expect that it's not about only cancellation of a membership action plan, as it was announced beforehand, but it's also about a very fast track for Ukraine NATO membership.
Russia does not work except it's backed up by power, by force. So is this why NATO is doing its best to include Ukraine in the discussion? They say they want to have a Ukraine-NATO angle to the summit without asking Ukraine to join NATO. And they also say there's a framework being created by NATO where countries can continually supply weapons and what have you, and the needs of the Ukrainian people through a format or a framework where this can be facilitated by NATO. And obviously, the weapons supply to Russia is a big concern, as most countries have not continued to do that or have not even started to do that, who have expressed that intention. So how important is it for the countries that have expressed their intention to supply and to continue to supply Ukraine with weapons to do so?
It is important because actually, as history shows us, this war is very, for me as a researcher, the objective vision and objective view of this war is very interesting, because this war speaks to us about history. And analyzing this war, we have to listen to historians. Though their voice is normally very silent, but today we have really listened to them, because as I said, history shows that when Europe, the most European countries, have passed the process of modernization and have found a way of peaceful coexistence and cooperation, Russia failed. Russia didn't do it, and Russia preserved the so-called semi-imperial existence when it continues to radiate aggression to its neighbors. Ukraine is not an exception. We can, during last 30 years after, as I said, the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was at the war for more than 20 years. So Russia conducted war against Moldova, against Georgia, inside Russia, against Chechnya, 2 Chechen wars. Russia continuously threatened with the war its neighbor countries, Baltic countries, which were already NATO members. So it was very high possibility that Russian authorities would try to provoke NATO to attack, for example, tiny Estonia, which is a very, very small country. And then NATO should take a decision on a political level to participate in war with Russia for tiny Estonia. So it's a very risky situation for NATO, but this is the reality. So the war in Ukraine, the Russian war in Ukraine now must be stopped in Ukraine, because if it is preserved in kind of peaceful agreement, or peaceful agreement without finishing with this war, without capitulation of Russia, then after some time, Russia will get more forces and will try to make a new attempt of aggression, probably to another European country. We don't know, but putting technical nuclear weapon in Belarus, it's a signal to someone, to maybe Western Belarus neighbors such as Poland and such as Baltic countries. So for NATO countries, supplying Ukrainians with weapons is defending themselves. That's the reason why it is so necessary for them, and why they keep see it as essential thing, especially, as I said, Eastern European countries, which really are afraid of Russian threat.
Doctor, you bring up the history of things, and Ukrainians and Russians know themselves pretty well. What about the Russian argument that the NATO membership bid of Ukraine was extremely provocative, and the Russian allegation that pro-Russian elements in Ukraine, or Ukrainians that wanted to go or be with Russia, were being targeted by the Ukrainian government, and then the Nazification allegation against President Zelensky?
Well, yeah, thank you for this question, because you mentioned all the myths and false narratives that Russians are spreading around. Just if we speak about Russian concerns about Ukrainian NATO membership, then look at Finland. Russia was very concerned about Finnish membership in NATO, but when it happened, Russians didn't say anything. So it's not such a big deal for them. It's not such a big threat for them anymore, or what? Why they're not speaking about it anymore? So Russia had very good relations with Europe till Russia started behaving aggressive towards Ukraine. It has very good energy contracts. It had very good economic cooperation and political cooperation. Investments of European investments in Russia were very, very high. So why to break it at one moment? Well, as I said, history has the answers for all of us, because Russia, as I said, hasn't passed, at least Russian elite hasn't passed this path of modernization of country. And to preserve its power, it needs to keep the society in a stance of war, of aggression, like the society that Russia is, the main thing that Russia is a victim. They say to their society, like Russian elite say to their society, that Russia is a victim of the West, that Russia didn't manage to develop because the rest of the world was against Russia and tried to suspend its development. But it's not true, and this was a kind of false reason to attack Russian neighbors. So well, that's. I'm sorry. I'm kind of away. So can you please get back to your question, and then I will.
No, you've
continue.
You've answered the question. You've answered the question. The last part of it was that he kept talking. That is, President Putin kept talking about the Nazification of Ukraine. Some links with Nazi Germany.
That's a very important issue, because it is strongly connected to the Second World War memory, which is totally subverted by Russian authorities, because like it's different. It's totally different than it is in Europe. Like then there are facts. Then the facts are. So Russia uses this myth of being a victim and being at the same time a savior. Like during the Second World War, Russian authorities tells the story that during the Second World War, Russia was the only one country, and Russian people were the only one people who literally saved the world from Nazism. And today they continue to spread this false information, like, and to connect it with their war in Ukraine, like they're saving Ukrainians from Nazism and they're saving Europeans from Nazism. So they're again saving everyone, being at the same time a victim of the rest of the world. So this is why I say that we have to go back to history, to listen to historians, and to try to debunk this Russian fake about the Russians as saviors from Nazism in the Second World War, because it's just a part of story. But the other big part of story that Stalin was an ally with Hitler, and Stalin together with Hitler attacked Poland in 1939 and divided Poland. And Stalin himself had big plans to conquer Europe and to invade Europe, but Hitler was just the first one. And so we also have to look at crimes of Stalinism, because crimes of Nazi Germany were condemned, were judged, but crimes against humanity of Stalin regime have never been condemned and have never been judged. And that's why Putin can refer to that might of Stalin and that glory of Stalin and Soviet Union, and try to justify modern Russian crimes with historical arguments. That's how it works. So, as I say, we have to look back to history very attentively and to try to find and to debunk Russian fakes also there.
Indeed, Joseph Stalin, very controversial figure in history. And finally, Doctor, where do you stand on the deployment of these munitions? You're talking about history, and the history of these cluster munitions is scary at best. It's incredible at worst. And at the end of the day, the countries, including the UK and other countries who say that the US should not supply Ukraine with these cluster munitions, are saying so out of concern for the Ukrainian civilians who have to pay for it for years to come. There's no record that these munitions go away easily into the night. They continue to explode for years and years, maiming people, killing people. We know that President Zelensky wants to win this war. But what is your position on the use of these weapons when he gets them from the United States?
Well, I can, right now, it's a small disclaimer, I will speak on my own. So this is just my personal position. When I talked once to my friend who is in the front line right now, he said, I asked him, like, how is it there? And he said, it's very bad. There are too much of them. Like, there are just too much of Russian soldiers at the front line, and Russia still has a very huge potential of mobilization. So Russia still can mobilize, if Russia wants, up to 2-3 million people. So it's enormous amount of soldiers, and we try to resist, but we obviously there are less Ukrainians than Russians. That's obviously. So he told me, it was half of a year ago, or even a year ago, he told me then we need cluster bombs just to destroy them, just to eliminate that enemy force that comes to the battlefield. It was the reality of the war, of the battlefield. There is nothing romantic in it. There is no romance in it. There is nothing like heroic in it. It's just a very brutal, very grief, very bad reality of war. It's either our soldiers die or Russian soldiers die. And as we see that Russia is not going to stop, then there is only one solution. They must be eliminated. About civilians, right now we have so many mines in our land that it will take, I don't know, even 100 years to demine Ukrainian land. So we realize that that territory is very dangerous for civilians. That territory is probably will be not appropriate for living there for a long time. So we have nothing to lose, actually, because when Russia comes, then Russia destroys everything. You can see it from pictures from destroyed cities of Ukraine, Bakhmut, Mariinka, etc. So when Russians move forward, they just destroy even the soil. Nothing can live there, nothing can be grown there, nothing can be built there. So for us, the stakes are very high, and cluster ammunition is what our soldiers really need right now to stop the Russian invasion.
It's a very hard situation to take, and we pray for a speedy conclusion to this debacle at the battlefield for the counteroffensive. Thank you so much, Dr. Olena Sniger, who is an expert at the Center for Global Studies, Ukraine, who joined us from Florence, Italy. Serdachna Dyakuyu, Buvайте.
Thank you. Buvайте. Дякую вам.
After the break, 6-year-old undergoes first of its kind heart transplant in Ukraine despite the raging war. Do stay with us.
It's engaging, fascinating, and insightful. Join us as we connect with the global community of Nigerians around the world. We talk about life in the diaspora, flying the Nigerian flag, their culture, socio-political activities, and survival stories on Channels Television.
Britain is quite a racist country, and where they see asylum seekers on the street and they have a very poor opinion of them.
Diaspora Network, engaging diasporans for development.
Welcome back to the final stretch of our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine as we turn our attention to brass tacks of business and how it affects the conflict in both countries. Laddie Williams is with us.
Yep.
Laddie, good morning.
Good morning.
Hungary's foreign minister will go to Turkey for talks on Black Sea grain deal.
Yeah, still about the Black Sea grain deal, which expires next week. Now, we're seeing, major countries involved are getting quite uneasy now, with Russia's stance on not renewing the deal, come next week, because we should be getting renewal by now, or indications, of a renewal, but we're not getting that yet. So the Minister for Agriculture in Hungary there, he's heading to Turkey because Turkey and UN are quite instrumental in brokering, this deal right now. So he's going there, to see how, we can make Turkey actually make, Russia come to the table and renew this deal. Another issue is going to be discussing there is about, because he's going to be speaking on behalf of Eastern and Central Europe this time, because Ukraine, most of their grains, pass through East and Central Europe, to get to other parts of the world at this time. And passing through, those countries is making it quite unprofitable for local suppliers there of grains and local farmers there, because the Ukrainian grain is quite cheap. So passing through there, we see some people buying it and, making it unprofitable for the local producers.
So is that Hungary's issue?
So he's going to be speaking on behalf of about 5 countries,
right,
from Eastern and Central Europe, to see how they can make it, easier for those countries, so that at the end of the day, the Ukraine grains pass through, they don't have to be sold in those countries. They just pass through and go to other parts of the world, basically.
Right, and the dollar retreats to a 2-month low.
Yeah. Yes.
Why? We thought that it was
Yeah, after that
Doing
incredible run in 2022, because, we saw the tightening cycle by the U.S. Fed, last year when inflation, got really high, due to the war and rising energy prices. But now we're seeing energy prices have come back, down to reality. That's talking about oil prices, natural gas, all of them, have come down. So now we're also seeing inflation retreat, in the U.S. Then the last meeting, the U.S. Fed, they paused, rates at the last meeting. There was no hike, there was no cut, it was a pause. And that is indicating that going forward, there might come a time this year, that the Fed will actually stop, raising rates. And who knows, maybe a cut might be, on the horizon. But it all depends on the June CPI data we're expecting on Wednesday. That's for the U.S. If it comes in hotter than expected, the U.S. Fed might, start off raising rates again. But at the end of the day, we know why they paused, because of the banking crisis that they saw in the first quarter of 2023. So they paused to, allow the banks, have a little breather, going forward. But at the end of the day, once there's, when we're not seeing a hawkish Fed, the U.S. dollar is going to, calm down from that big run we saw in 2022. And it's hit about 101 points. That's the DXY, the dollar index that tracks the dollar against 5 other currencies. So we're seeing it at 101 now. It's down about 0.2% this morning. So we're still seeing that, downward move, and it's still brisk on for most investors at this point.
And what's driving the sentiment of the oil prices edging higher?
Oh, yeah,
at early trade?
Yeah, we're seeing oil prices up this morning. Yesterday was down. We're still seeing that whole demand-supply dynamic in that market. But now it's the supply cuts we're seeing from Saudi Arabia and Russia. That's what's helping keep the price up at this time, even though, all eyes still on that CPI data for the U.S. coming out Wednesday. But all, at the end of the day, investors are looking out for that hiking trajectory. How are they going to keep hiking rates? Because that's going to definitely impact demand. So at the end of the day, we're seeing prices, helped by that at this point, even though there's still demand concerns, going forward, that's, suppressing, oil prices at this point. And definitely, we see Saudi Arabia and Russia, holding on to their cuts even on to August. And that's what's, helping keep the prices up at this time. So it's still that whole dynamic playing out in the oil market at this time.
Thanks a lot, Laddie. Laddie Williams, our business correspondent, who you can join and you should join on Business Morning after this program.
Exactly.
Indeed. Finally, amidst the raging war and constant threat of Russian missiles, a successful heart transplant has been performed on a 6-year-old girl. Authorities with the Heart Institute of Ukraine's Ministry of Health revealed that the heart previously belonged to a 4-year-old boy. The 6-year-old girl, who is a patient at the Heart Institute in Kiev, was on the waiting list for a donor when she received the heart of the boy, who doctors had declared brain dead after suffering a brain aneurysm. That's our coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine today. Thank you for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thanks to our guests, our producers, and to you, our viewers. See you again.